An officer assaulted a teen for insubordination, but one video turned the tide. What was behind the story? Watch to the end. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching this video from. The street lights flickered as Jeremy Williams stepped out of the library. His legs were heavy after hours of sitting hunched over a desk, poring over math problems he barely understood but knew he had to master. A small notebook, its pages worn and full of scribbled equations, peeked out of his backpack. For Jeremy, this notebook was more than just a study tool. It was a symbol of hope, a promise he made to himself and to his late father. Someday, he would become an engineer, escape the suffocating grip of poverty, and give his mother and younger sister a better life. Jeremy tugged his hoodie over his head as the chilly night air nipped at his skin. It was late, later than he intended to leave. The streets of his neighborhood, dimly lit and eerily quiet, always carried an air of unease after dark. The rhythmic hum of traffic from the nearby highway seemed distant, like a low drumbeat underscoring the tension in the air. As he walked, Jeremy's mind drifted. He thought about the equations he'd spent the evening wrestling with, about how close he was to acing the upcoming exam. He thought about his mother, working her second shift at the diner, and his sister Lily, who'd likely fallen asleep waiting for him to come home. He adjusted his headphones and let the music drown out the uneasy silence around him. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few flickering neon signs and the occasional shadow of someone hurriedly locking up their store. Jeremy quickened his pace as he passed a group of teenagers loitering by a closed convenience store. They were older boys, rough-looking, their laughter sharp and mocking as it carried through the air. Jeremy kept his eyes forward, pretending not to notice as one of them muttered, "Stay out of trouble, kid," followed by a chuckle that made his skin crawl. The group didn't follow, but their laughter lingered in Jeremy's ears like a warning. He shook his head and pushed forward, his sneakers scuffing softly against the cracked pavement. It wasn't until he turned onto a quieter street that Jeremy noticed the police cruiser creeping behind him. He didn't look back, though he could feel its presence like a weight pressing against his back. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed a patrol car trailing him on his way home, but tonight, something felt different. The cruiser slowed to a crawl. Jeremy tried to focus on the music blaring in his headphones, but his chest tightened with each step. "Hey, stop!" a voice barked behind him. It was sharp, authoritative, and carried a tone that made Jeremy's stomach drop. He didn't hear it, though. Not really. The music drowned it out, and he was too deep in his own thoughts to notice the urgency in the officer's voice. When the shout came again, louder this time, Jeremy instinctively froze. But then, thinking it might not be directed at him, he continued walking. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and stepped onto the cracked sidewalk. The officer, Thomas Randolph, cursed under his breath. To him, the kid's slow pace and nonchalant attitude were signs of defiance. Randolph had been on the force for over 15 years, and his view of the world had hardened into something rigid and unforgiving. He saw Jeremy's hood, his headphones, the way he didn't turn around immediately, and made a snap judgment. To Randolph, this wasn't just a teenager walking home. This was a threat. Randolph stepped out of the cruiser, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. "Hey, I said stop!" he barked, his hand already reaching for the baton at his hip. His voice cut through the night like a blade, loud enough to make Jeremy finally pause. Jeremy turned, startled, and pulled his headphones down around his neck. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Randolph didn't answer. Instead, he closed the distance between them in a few quick strides. Before Jeremy could react, the officer's hand was on his shoulder, spinning him around and forcing him to the ground. The asphalt scraped against Jeremy's palms as he stumbled and fell. "Put your hands behind your back," Randolph ordered, his voice sharp and unyielding. What did I do?" Jeremy stammered, panic rising in his chest. He tried to comply, but his movements were clumsy, his body trembling from the shock of the sudden aggression. "You don't move unless I tell you to, got it?" Randolph barked, his knee pressing into Jeremy's back. The weight was unbearable, pinning him against the ground. "I didn't do anything," Jeremy cried out, his voice muffled against the rough pavement. He tried to twist his head to look at Randolph, but the officer's hand shoved it back down. The baton came down hard against Jeremy's ribs once, then twice. Pain exploded through his side, stealing his breath. "You think you can just walk away when I tell you to stop?" Randolph growled, his face a mask of barely contained rage. Jeremy's vision blurred from the pain, his protests reduced to gasps. He tried to explain, to say he hadn't heard the officer, but the words wouldn't come. The world around him felt distant, like he was sinking into a void where nothing made sense. A second officer arrived on the scene, a younger man named Miller. He stepped out of his cruiser, his face pale as he took in the scene. Randolph barely glanced at him. "This kid was resisting," Randolph snapped. "Help me cuff him." Miller hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over his own baton. He could see the terror in Jeremy's eyes, the blood trickling from his split lip, but he said nothing. Finally, he nodded and knelt beside Randolph, grabbing Jeremy's arms and yanking them behind his back. The metal of the handcuffs bit into Jeremy's wrist sharp and unrelenting. His hands were trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He couldn't understand how a simple walk home had turned into this nightmare. The distant sound of a door opening caught Miller's attention. A woman, middle-aged, wearing an apron stained with grease, stood on the porch of a nearby house. Her face was a mix of confusion and fear as she took in the scene. Another figure, smaller and younger, stepped out behind her. "Jeremy?" the woman called, her voice trembling. Jeremy turned his head slightly, wincing against the pain. "Mom?" Randolph glanced at the woman, his eyes narrowing. "Stay back," he shouted, standing and placing himself between her and Jeremy. "This is police business." The woman, Mrs. Williams, took a step forward despite the warning. "That's my son. What are you doing to him?" Randolph's hand moved to the holster on his hip. "I said, stay back." Mrs. Williams froze, her hands trembling at her sides. Behind her, Jeremy's younger sister Lily clutched her arm, her wide eyes fixed on her brother. "Please," Mrs. Williams pleaded, her voice breaking. "He's just a kid. He didn't do anything wrong." Randolph sneered. "You want to join him? Keep talking." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jeremy's chest heaved as he fought back tears, his body still aching from the blows. He could only watch as his mother and sister stood frozen, helpless to stop what was happening. The chapter closes with the sound of a second police car pulling up to the curb, its flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the quiet street. The nightmare was far from over. The fluorescent lights of the police precinct buzzed faintly, their cold glare bouncing off the sterile white walls. Jeremy was dragged inside, his feet barely brushing the ground as Officer Randolph and his partner Miller hauled him through the door. His wrists throbbed, the metal cuffs cutting into his skin. Blood from his split lip had dried on his chin, leaving a sticky trail down his neck. Behind them, Mrs. Williams stumbled into the precinct, her hands tightly cuffed behind her back. Her apron was torn, her knees scraped from being forced onto the ground earlier. Lily followed, her small frame trembling as she clung to her mother with her cuffed hands. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of help. "Processing room," Randolph barked to the officer at the desk, his tone clipped and devoid of emotion. "Got 3 resistors." Jeremy lifted his head weakly, his voice barely a whisper. "We didn't do anything." Randolph's grip on his arm tightened, yanking him forward. "Shut your mouth." Mrs. Williams turned her head, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, my son, he's hurt. Look at him. He needs a doctor." Randolph sneered, not even glancing at her. "He's fine. Kids like him are tougher than they look." Miller shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering toward Jeremy's bruised face. But he said nothing, keeping his gaze fixed on the floor as he followed Randolph into the processing room. Jeremy was thrown into a metal chair, the impact sending a jolt of pain through his already battered ribs. He winced, struggling to adjust himself in the seat as the cuffs dug deeper into his skin. Mrs. Williams and Lily were seated across the room, their faces pale and etched with fear. A desk sergeant approached, clipboard in hand. He glanced at Randolph, his brow furrowed. "What's the charge?" "Resist an arrest, obstruction, and disorderly conduct," Randolph said without hesitation, his voice dripping with authority. Mrs. Williams shot to her feet despite her restraints. "That's a lie. He was just walking home. We all were. You attacked us." The sergeant raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his pen hovering over the clipboard. Randolph's face darkened, and he strode over to Mrs. Williams, towering over her. "Sit down." Mrs. Williams didn't move. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she met Randolph's glare with one of her own. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then Randolph reached out and shoved her back into the chair. "You people don't know when to quit, do you?" he hissed. "Think you can just mouth off to a cop and walk away?" "Leave her alone," Jeremy shouted, his voice hoarse but filled with defiance. Randolph turned to him, his expression a mix of amusement and contempt. "What did you say to me?" Jeremy's jaw tightened. He could feel his mother's eyes on him, silently begging him to stay quiet, but he couldn't. Not now. "I said, leave her alone." Randolph's laughter was cold and sharp. "You've got a big mouth for someone in your position." He took a step toward Jeremy, his hand moving to the baton on his belt. Miller, standing near the doorway, shifted uncomfortably. "Tom, maybe—" "Quiet," Randolph snapped, cutting him off. "This kid needs to learn some respect." Before Randolph could take another step, the desk sergeant cleared his throat loudly. "That's enough," he said firmly, his eyes narrowing at Randolph. "Get them booked and into Holden. Now." Randolph hesitated, his hand still on his baton, but after a tense moment, he relented. With a grunt, he turned away from Jeremy and gestured for Miller to start the booking process. Jeremy was led into a small holding cell, the cold metal bars closing around him like a cage. His mother and Lily were placed in a cell across the corridor. Jeremy sank onto the hard bench, his head resting against the wall as he fought back tears of frustration and pain. "Jeremy," his mother called softly from the other cell. He turned his head, meeting her eyes through the bars. "Don't say anything. Not to them, not to anyone. Just stay quiet, okay? We'll get through this." "How, Mom?" Jeremy's voice cracked. "They're treating us like criminals." Mrs. Williams didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. Instead, she reached through the bars, her fingers brushing against the air between them as if trying to touch her son. Lily sat beside her, clutching her knees to her chest and staring at the floor. The hours dragged on. Jeremy lost track of time, the fluorescent lights never dimming, the sterile smell of the precinct burning his nose. His ribs ached with every breath and his wrists were raw from the cuffs. Occasionally, Randolph or another officer would walk by, throwing them mocking glances or muttering under their breath. At one point, a young female officer approached the cells, her face softening as she looked at Lily. She crouched down in front of the bars, her voice low. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Lily didn't respond. She just stared at her knees, her shoulders shaking slightly. Mrs. Williams glared at the officer, her voice sharp. "You can save your sympathy. Where were you when they dragged us in here like animals?" The officer's face hardened and she stood up. "I'm just trying to help." "You want to help?" Mrs. Williams snapped. "Get my son a doctor." The officer hesitated, her eyes flickering to Jeremy's bruised face. "I'll see what I can do," she said quietly before walking away. As the night wore on, the adrenaline that had kept Jeremy awake began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. He closed his eyes, his head resting against the cold wall of the cell. Images of the night played in his mind, the flashing lights, the weight of Randolph's knee on his back, his mother's screams. He wanted to believe it was all a nightmare, but the ache in his ribs and the sting of the metal cuffs reminded him it was all too real. Across the hall, Mrs. Williams sat with her arms around Lily, whispering reassurances she didn't quite believe. She kept her eyes on Jeremy, silently willing him to stay strong. None of them knew what the morning would bring, but one thing was clear. This night would change their lives forever. Morning came slowly, the sterile gray light of dawn filtering through the small, reinforced windows of the police precinct. Jeremy stirred on the cold metal bench of his cell, his body aching from the blows he'd taken the night before. Every breath felt like a struggle, his ribs throbbing with a dull, persistent pain. Across the corridor, he could see his mother slumped against the bars of her cell, one arm protectively wrapped around Lily, who was curled up beside her. The night had been long and unforgiving for all of them. A loud clank echoed through the holding area as an officer unlocked the main door and entered. He carried a clipboard and wore a look of practiced indifference. Jeremy tensed instinctively, his eyes following the officer as he approached the cells. "Jeremy Williams," the officer called, glancing at the clipboard. He didn't wait for a response before continuing. "You're being transferred to a separate holding area. Get up." Jeremy hesitated, his body protesting even the slightest movement. His mother's voice cut through the silence. "Where are you taking him? He's just a boy. He shouldn't even be here." The officer didn't look at her. "Ma'am, I suggest you keep your voice down if you don't want any additional charges." "Charges for what?" she shot back, her voice rising. "For asking why my son is being treated like a criminal when he hasn't done anything wrong." The officer sighed, clearly uninterested in a debate. He gestured for another officer to step in, a larger man with a menacing demeanor. "If she keeps talking, separate her too." Jeremy shook his head, forcing himself to his feet. "It's fine, Mom," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I'll be fine." He wasn't sure if he believed his own words, but he couldn't bear to see his mother or Lily hurt any more than they already had been. With a sharp tug, the officer pulled him out of the cell and led him down the hallway. The new holding area was smaller, more isolated. Jeremy was shoved into another cell, the door slamming shut behind him. This one had no view of his mother or sister. He was completely alone. Minutes stretched into hours. The only sounds were the distant murmur of officers talking and the occasional clang of a door. Jeremy's thoughts raced. He replayed the events of the previous night over and over, searching for some way he could have avoided this. Had he done something wrong? Should he have stopped walking as soon as he saw the police car? Should he have spoken differently? Deep down, he knew the answer. None of it would have mattered. His hoodie, his skin, his mere presence on that street had been enough to make him a target. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, the city was beginning to wake up. The video of Jeremy's arrest, captured by a neighbor's shaky smartphone, had started making its way through social media. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to show Randolph pinning Jeremy to the ground, his baton coming down repeatedly as Jeremy cried out in pain. The sound of Mrs. Williams's screams echoed in the background, raw and heart-wrenching. By mid-morning, the video had gone viral. Dozens of people shared it, tagging local news outlets and demanding accountability. Activist groups in the area picked up on the story, quickly organizing a response. This wasn't the first time such an incident had occurred in their community, but the brutality on display had struck a nerve. Among those who saw the video was Marcus Hall, a local attorney and well-known civil rights advocate. Marcus had spent years fighting cases of police misconduct, often pro bono. When he watched the video of Jeremy's arrest, his jaw tightened. He recognized Randolph immediately. The officer had been the subject of several complaints in the past, though none had ever led to disciplinary action. Marcus didn't hesitate. He picked up his phone and dialed a colleague who worked in the precinct's legal department. "I need to see the Williams family," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Back in the precinct, Jeremy was startled by the sound of approaching footsteps. The door to his holding area creaked open, and a man in a dark suit stepped in. He was tall, with sharp features and a confident stride. His eyes softened when they met Jeremy's. "Jeremy Williams?" the man asked. Jeremy nodded cautiously. "Yeah, who are you?" "My name is Marcus Hall," the man said, pulling a chair up to the bars of the cell. "I'm a lawyer, and I'm here to help you and your family." Jeremy blinked, his mind struggling to process the sudden change in tone. "A lawyer? We didn't—" "Someone sent me the video of what happened to you," Marcus interrupted gently, "and I think you've been wrongfully arrested. I want to represent you." Jeremy stared at him, unsure whether to feel relief or suspicion. "You've seen the video?" Marcus nodded. "The whole city has. People are angry, Jeremy. They're demanding answers. But first, we need to get you out of here." Over the next few hours, Marcus worked tirelessly. He demanded access to Jeremy's medical records, arguing that his injuries needed immediate attention. He filed motions to have the charges against Jeremy and his family dismissed, citing the video as evidence of excessive force and unlawful arrest. He also contacted local media, ensuring the story would continue to gain traction. Outside the precinct, a small group of protesters began to gather. They held signs reading, "Justice for Jeremy" and "Stop Police Brutality." Their chants grew louder as the day went on, drawing the attention of passers-by and eventually the news cameras. Inside, Randolph watched the unfolding chaos with a scowl. He wasn't used to being questioned, let alone challenged so publicly. He stormed into the precinct captain's office, slamming the door behind him. "This is getting out of hand," he growled. "We need to control the narrative before it gets any worse." The captain, a weary man with more political savvy than patience, rubbed his temples. "Control the narrative? Randolph, there's a video. The narrative is already out of our hands." Randolph's jaw tightened. That kid and his family, they're making this bigger than it is. We need to shut it down." The captain shook his head. "No, what we need is to handle this carefully. The mayor's already called. He wants an internal investigation. Until then, you're on administrative leave." Randolph's face flushed with anger, but he knew better than to argue. He stormed out of the office, his mind racing. He wasn't going down without a fight. By evening, Marcus had secured the release of Jeremy, Mrs. Williams, and Lily on bail. As they stepped out of the precinct, they were met with cheers from the small crowd of protesters. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Marcus guided the family through the chaos with practiced ease. Jeremy clung to his mother, his body still aching but his heart lighter than it had been in hours. For the first time since the nightmare began, he felt a glimmer of hope. But as he looked out at the growing crowd, he realized something else. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger than one family. It was about a community demanding justice, about a system that needed to change. And Jeremy was determined to be part of that change. The air outside the precinct was electric. The crowd had grown larger since the Williams family's release, their chants echoing through the streets. "Justice for Jeremy" and "End police brutality" were scrawled across makeshift signs. Some held high, others waved rhythmically in the air. The media swarmed the scene, microphones and cameras capturing every moment. Jeremy felt the weight of 100 eyes on him as he stepped out of the precinct, his mother's arm draped protectively over his shoulders. Lily clung to her other side, her face half hidden behind her mother's arm. The flashes from the cameras made Jeremy wince, and the shouting reporters only added to the chaos. "Jeremy, how do you feel about being released? Do you believe this was a case of racial profiling? What do you have to say to the police department?" The questions came rapid fire, overlapping one another until they became indistinguishable. Jeremy opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Marcus Hall raised a hand, commanding the crowd's attention. "Jeremy and his family have been through a traumatic ordeal," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "They've been unlawfully detained, physically assaulted, and publicly humiliated. This is not just about one family. This is about a broken system that allows officers like Thomas Randolph to abuse their power without consequence. We will be pursuing legal action, and we will not stop until justice is served." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising in a unified roar. Jeremy glanced at Marcus, a mixture of gratitude and awe washing over him. He wasn't used to people standing up for him, especially not on this scale. That night, the story dominated the local news. Every station replayed the now infamous video of Jeremy's arrest, intercut with clips of the protest outside the precinct. Commentators debated the implications, some condemning the officer's actions, others cautioning against jumping to conclusions. The mayor issued a brief statement, promising a thorough investigation, but his words did little to quell the growing outrage. By morning, the protest had doubled in size. People from all over the city had gathered outside the precinct, their numbers spilling into nearby streets. Activist groups set up makeshift stations, distributing water bottles and flyers demanding police reform. Local businesses donated supplies, and community leaders took turns addressing the crowd with megaphones. Jeremy watched the coverage from the small living room of their apartment. His mother sat beside him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Lily was in her room, refusing to come out, still shaken from the events of the previous night. "They're saying your name," Mrs. Williams murmured, her voice a mix of pride and worry. Jeremy nodded, his eyes fixed on the screen. Yeah. This isn't just about you anymore, she continued, turning to look at him. You understand that, right? These people, they're fighting for all of us. Jeremy swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. I know, Mom. I didn't ask for any of this. I know you didn't, she said, reaching out to take his hand. But sometimes we don't get to choose. Sometimes the fight chooses us. Meanwhile, at the police department, tensions were running high. Inside the precinct, Randolph sat in a small office, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. The captain stood over him, arms crossed, his expression grim. You've brought a storm down on this department, the captain said, his voice low but sharp. The mayor is breathing down my neck. The media is outside demanding answers. And now I've got half the city protesting because of your actions. Randolph leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a sneer. I was doing my job. That kid was resisting. Resisting? The captain's voice rose. There's a video, Randolph. The whole world saw you beating a teenager who wasn't even fighting back. Do you understand the position you've put us in? Randolph shrugged, his demeanor unapologetic. These people need to learn to respect authority. The captain slammed a hand down on the desk, his patience snapping. You're done here. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. Turn in your badge and gun. Randolph's face darkened, but he didn't argue. He stood, unholstered his weapon, and slammed it down on the desk along with his badge. You're making a mistake, he growled before storming out of the office. As the protest swelled, Jeremy found himself thrust into the spotlight. Reporters camped outside his apartment building, hoping for a statement. Activist groups reached out, offering their support and inviting him to speak at rallies. It was overwhelming, and Jeremy wasn't sure how to navigate it all. Marcus stepped in to help, acting as both a legal advocate and a mentor. He explained the importance of using this moment to push for real change, not just for Jeremy, but for the entire community. We have their attention now, Marcus said one evening as they sat in the apartment's cramped kitchen. The question is, what are we going to do with it? Jeremy hesitated. I don't know if I'm the right person for this. Marcus smiled gently. You didn't choose this, Jeremy, but that doesn't mean you can't rise to the occasion. People are looking to you because they see themselves in you. You have a chance to make a difference. The first rally took place the next day. Jeremy stood on a makeshift stage in the center of the crowd, his heart pounding as he looked out at the sea of faces. Some were familiar, neighbors, classmates, but most were strangers, united by a shared anger and a demand for justice. Marcus handed him the microphone, his expression encouraging. Jeremy took a deep breath and stepped forward. I'm not a public speaker, he began, his voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. I'm just a kid who wanted to walk home. But last night, I learned that sometimes just existing is enough to make you a target. I didn't do anything wrong, but that didn't stop them from beating me, arresting me, and treating me like I was less than human. The crowd murmured in agreement, their energy palpable. But this isn't just about me, Jeremy continued, his voice steady now. This is about every person who's been stopped, harassed, or hurt just because of the way they look. It's about a system that's broken and needs to change. And if my story can help make that happen, then I'm willing to fight. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a wave of support that washed over Jeremy. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about standing up, speaking out, and refusing to be silenced. But as the cheers echoed through the streets, Randolph watched from a distance, his face twisted with resentment. This wasn't over. Not for him. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint rustle of papers and the occasional cough. Jeremy sat at the plaintiff's table beside Marcus Hall, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His mother and Lily were behind him, flanked by a small group of supporters from the community. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, presided over the room, her gavel resting heavily on the bench. Across from them sat Officer Randolph, his expression unreadable, and his lawyer, a polished man with an air of practiced confidence. This was the moment Jeremy had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The charges against him and his family had been dropped, but this wasn't about clearing their names anymore. This was about holding Randolph accountable. Marcus rose to deliver his opening statement, his voice calm and measured, but carrying the weight of righteous indignation. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about power, its abuse, and the devastating consequences it leaves in its wake. Jeremy Williams was a young man walking home from the library minding his own business when he was brutally attacked by someone sworn to protect him. The evidence will show that Officer Randolph's actions were not only unjustified, but fueled by prejudice and a blatant disregard for the law. He paused, letting the words settle over the room. This case is not just about Jeremy. It's about sending a message that no one is above the law, not even those who wear a badge. The jury listened intently, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Randolph's lawyer stood next, his tone smooth and dismissive. This case is about perception. My client, Officer Randolph, was doing his job in a high-crime area. He encountered a situation that to him seemed threatening, and he acted to ensure public safety. The prosecution would have you believe this was a case of racial profiling, but the evidence will show otherwise. Jeremy's stomach churned. He wanted to shout, to refute the lawyer's words, but Marcus placed a calming hand on his shoulder. The prosecution began by presenting the video of Jeremy's arrest. The grainy footage played on a large screen for the entire courtroom to see. Gasps rippled through the audience as Randolph's baton struck Jeremy's side, his voice barking orders even as Jeremy lay motionless on the ground. Mrs. Williams's screams echoed faintly in the background, a haunting soundtrack to the violence. The defense attempted to downplay the video's impact, arguing that it lacked context. Randolph's lawyer claimed that the officer had no way of knowing whether Jeremy was armed or dangerous. But Marcus countered with testimony from witnesses who had seen the incident unfold, including the neighbor who filmed the video. I saw the whole thing, the neighbor testified. Jeremy wasn't doing anything wrong. He didn't even know the officer was calling him at first. He wasn't resisting. He was just scared. The defense faltered but pressed on, painting Randolph as a seasoned officer making a split-second decision. They called him to the stand, where he spoke with a calm, calculated demeanor. I acted based on my training and the situation at hand, Randolph said, his tone measured. In my line of work, hesitation can mean the difference between life and death. Marcus didn't let him off easily. When it was his turn to cross-examine, his questions cut through Randolph's facade like a scalpel. Officer Randolph, did you see any weapon on Jeremy Williams? No, Randolph admitted, his jaw tightening. Did he make any aggressive moves toward you? Randolph hesitated. Not exactly, but yes or no, officer. Did Jeremy Williams make any aggressive moves toward you? No. The courtroom murmured, the weight of Randolph's admission sinking in. The trial stretched over days, each one more grueling than the last. Jeremy took the stand, his voice trembling as he recounted the night of his arrest. "I didn't hear him at first because I had my headphones on," he explained. "When I finally turned around, he was already coming at me. I didn't even have time to explain. He just started hitting me." His voice cracked and he glanced at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. "I thought I was going to die." The courtroom was silent, the gravity of Jeremy's words hanging heavy in the air. Outside the courthouse, the protests had grown even larger. The steps were packed with people holding signs and chanting for justice. News crews captured every moment, broadcasting the trial's developments across the nation. For many, this case had become a symbol of the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement. But not everyone was supportive. Online, trolls and detractors flooded comment sections with hateful rhetoric, accusing Jeremy and his family of playing the victim or trying to ruin a good officer's career. Jeremy tried not to read the comments, but it was hard to ignore the constant notifications on his phone. Marcus noticed the toll it was taking. One evening, as they prepared for another day in court, he pulled Jeremy aside. "You're doing great," he said, "but you need to remember, this fight isn't just for you. It's for every person who's been in your shoes and didn't get a chance to speak out." Jeremy nodded, his resolve hardening. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As the trial neared its conclusion, Marcus delivered a powerful closing argument. "Jeremy Williams didn't choose to be a victim," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "He didn't ask to be beaten, humiliated, and arrested for the simple act of walking home. But today, you have the power to choose. You can choose justice. You can choose accountability. You can send a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Not in our city, not in our country, not anywhere." The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courtroom unbearable. Finally, they returned with a verdict. "Officer Randolph," the foreperson began, her voice steady, "we find you guilty of using excessive force under color of law." The room erupted. Some people cheered, others cried, and a few officers in the back exchanged dark looks. Jeremy felt a wave of relief wash over him, though it was tinged with exhaustion. This victory had come at a cost: his privacy, his peace of mind, and the scars he would carry for the rest of his life. But it was a victory nonetheless. Randolph was sentenced to probation and mandatory community service, a punishment that felt too lenient to many. Still, the verdict sent ripples through the city. Activist groups seized on the momentum, demanding broader reforms and greater accountability for law enforcement. Jeremy and his family returned home, their lives forever changed. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, they could breathe a little easier. And as Jeremy sat in his room that night, staring at the notebook he'd been carrying the night of his arrest, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The courtroom verdict had been the first step in what Jeremy quickly realized was a much longer journey. The days following Officer Randolph's sentencing were a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and community gatherings. Jeremy found himself at the center of a movement he never intended to lead, his name now synonymous with the fight for justice in their city. The protests didn't stop with the verdict. They grew louder, their demands more urgent. Independent oversight for the police department, mandatory body cameras, and better training to prevent excessive use of force. Jeremy's story had become a rallying cry, but with that attention came responsibility. A responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready to bear. The Williams family returned to their small apartment, hoping for a moment of peace, but their home had become a beacon for supporters and activists. The knocks on the door rarely stopped. Neighbors bringing food, community leaders offering their help, journalists asking for statements. Mrs. Williams tried to manage the flow of people as best she could, but the constant attention was overwhelming. "You're doing too much," she said to Jeremy one evening as he prepared to attend yet another rally. "You need to rest." "I can't, Mom," Jeremy replied, pulling on a clean shirt. His ribs still ached when he moved too quickly, but he ignored the pain. "People are counting on me. If I stop now, it'll all feel like it was for nothing." Mrs. Williams sighed, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than anyone could have asked of you, Jeremy. But don't lose yourself in this. You're still a teenager. You've got your whole life ahead of you." Jeremy smiled faintly, but her words lingered in his mind as he headed out the door. The rally that evening was one of the largest yet. Hundreds of people filled the park, their signs and voices merging into a powerful display of unity. Jeremy stood on the stage, the crowd's energy washing over him. Beside him, Marcus Hall waited patiently, his presence a calming anchor in the storm of emotions. When it was Jeremy's turn to speak, he stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath and scanned the crowd. There were so many faces, some familiar, others strangers, but all of them looked to him with hope and determination. "I want to thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "When this all started, I didn't think anyone would care. I thought I was just another kid who got caught in a bad situation and that no one would listen to me. But you've proven me wrong." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Jeremy waited for them to quiet before continuing. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been treated unfairly, who's been silenced or ignored. It's about making sure that no one has to go through what I went through, or worse. We have a chance to change things, and we can't let that chance slip away." The applause was deafening, but Jeremy barely heard it. His mind was already racing with ideas, ways to keep the momentum going, ways to turn the energy of the movement into lasting change. The next morning, Marcus met with the Williams family in their apartment. He brought coffee and pastries, a rare moment of normalcy amid the chaos. "We need to talk about what's next," he said, setting a stack of papers on the kitchen table. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Williams asked, her brow furrowing. "Jeremy's case has brought a lot of attention to the issues in this city," Marcus explained. "But attention isn't enough. If we want real change, we need to organize. We need to push for new policies, better oversight, and accountability." Jeremy nodded, already understanding where this was going. "What can I do?" "You've already done a lot," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. "But if you're willing, you could be the face of something bigger. We could start a community organization, something to fight for justice not just for you, but for everyone." Mrs. Williams hesitated. "That's a big responsibility. He's just a boy." "I know," Marcus said, meeting her gaze. "But he's also a leader, and he won't be doing this alone." Jeremy looked at his mother, then at Marcus. "I want to do it," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "I don't want anyone else to feel like I did that night." Over the next few weeks, Jeremy and Marcus worked tirelessly to establish their organization, which they named Voices for Justice. They held meetings in community centers, invited local activists to join their cause, and even started a fundraising campaign to support their efforts. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up, and the movement grew stronger with each passing day. Jeremy found himself balancing school with his new role as an activist. His teachers were supportive, often giving him extra time on assignments or allowing him to use class projects to further his work with the organization. His classmates, once distant and unsure how to approach him, now rallied around him, inspired by his courage and determination. Meanwhile, the police department faced mounting pressure. The internal investigation into Randolph's actions uncovered a pattern of misconduct, leading to his permanent dismissal and the resignation of several senior officers. The department announced new policies, including mandatory body cameras and de-escalation training, but the community remained vigilant, determined to ensure these changes were more than just empty promises. Jeremy attended the first city council meeting where the new policies were discussed. He stood at the podium, his voice clear and unwavering as he addressed the council members. "This is a step in the right direction," he said. "But it's only a step. We need to keep moving forward, and we need to hold each other accountable, because justice isn't just a word. It's something we have to fight for every day." Months later, as the movement continued to grow, Jeremy found a moment to reflect. He sat in his room, the same notebook from the night of his arrest open on his desk. The pages were filled with equations, but now they were joined by notes and ideas for future projects with Voices for Justice. He picked up a pen and wrote a new goal at the top of the page: build a world where justice is for everyone. Mrs. Williams knocked softly on his door, poking her head inside. "You okay?" Jeremy turned to her and smiled. "Yeah, Mom, I'm okay." As she closed the door, he looked out the window at the city beyond. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time he felt like he was on the right path, and he wasn't alone. Together, they were building something stronger than fear, stronger than hate. They were building a future. Thank you for watching to the end. Subscribe to not miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and family to discuss important topics together. And check out our other videos. There are equally profound stories waiting for you there. Your feedback is important to us.